For workers with symptoms to stay at home as the state records 24 new cases. A new exposure site for the Northern Territory after a positive case breached quarantine.
Because we cannot trust all the information the person has given us, he is being re-interviewed, should I say interrogated, by the police.
Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull calls the nation's vaccine rollout a phenomenal failure of public administration.
And coming up on The Business, million-dollar listings, the top end of the housing market sees surging interest from overseas investors.
Hello, welcome to ABC News. I'm Karina Carvalho. There are encouraging signs from the states and territories today, with several reporting no new cases of COVID-19. It's welcome news for millions of people in lockdown. Here's the coronavirus situation across the country. In New South Wales, 24 cases were recorded, but it's a second student nurse and an aged care worker becoming infected that has authorities on alert. More than half of the new cases were infectious while in the community, prompting a warning from the Premier about shopping. In Queensland, on the second day of the state's snap 3-day lockdown, just 2 cases were recorded, but the Premier has warned they're not out of the woods yet. Authorities say a decision on lifting the lockdown there will be based on figures tomorrow. The Northern Territory recorded 1 new infection today, a close contact of the initial Tanami mine case. It brings that cluster to 16. No new cases were recorded in Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia or Western Australia. The New South Wales Premier is pleading with people to stay home or risk the lockdown failing. Gladys Berejiklian says too many people who have symptoms are moving about and even going to work.
It's a grey area in our health system.
At the moment, there is not mandatory vaccination for all healthcare workers.
First, it was an unvaccinated student nurse who worked at Fairfield and Royal North Shore hospitals while infectious. The 24-year-old woman remains in isolation.
One of her household contacts is positive.
The virus was also passed on to one of her colleagues who worked at the same places and here at the Royal Ryde Rehabilitation Hospital. An aged care worker at Summit Care has subsequently become infected and was not vaccinated. But
around 135 out of the 149 residents at Summit Care were vaccinated.
There are 24 new cases, more than half were infectious while in the community. 7 are under investigation with no known source. 2 people are in ICU, 1 is on a ventilator. 5 days into lockdown and the cases are steady. Even still, there was a warning from the Premier.
A number of those cases were people who were conducting work in the last few days, some with symptoms, and we can't continue to have that happen.
Shopping centres have dominated a list of new venues on high alert. Pacific Square Shopping Centre in Maroubra, Westfield East Gardens and Burwood, to name a few.
Where you can, do your shopping online. Where you can, don't go to places where there's lots of other people.
Also of major concern, a Virgin flight that landed here in Sydney last weekend after travelling from the Gold Coast. A crew member on board flight VA524 tested positive and now 2 passengers have as well. 60 people were fined for breaching public health orders. Southwestern Sydney and the eastern suburbs identified as problem spots.
We are stopping and propping many people, and again it's just disappointing that infringements continue to be issued.
It's an anxious wait for the results tonight for the hundreds of patients and staff from 4 health facilities. Mark Reddy, ABC News, Sydney.
Reporter Mark Reddy is at a mass vaccination centre in Homebush, which is now an exposure site.
On Tuesday, a person unknowingly infected with coronavirus visited this vaccination hub here at Olympic Park between 3:30 and 5 p.m. So anyone who was here during that time is considered a close contact. The advice is to get tested immediately and self-isolate for 14 days regardless of the result. Now, this site has undergone a deep clean and has reopened tonight. There is a queue stretching right around the block. Hundreds of people are here, but the advice is really simple. If you do have the mildest of flu-like symptoms, a scratchy throat, a runny nose, to get tested, to stay home and rebook that appointment, because the last thing anyone wants is an outbreak at a vaccination centre.
Top-end residents have been left hanging tonight about whether the lockdown will end tomorrow. The Territory Government has announced a new exposure site, claiming a man who tested positive to COVID-19 lied to authorities about his whereabouts. The Territory also has another positive case, but it's believed he was in quarantine while infectious.
The desert town now deserted. Alice Springs in its first full day of lockdown after one infected miner spent hours at the airport. More than 100 close and casual contacts have been identified so far. Just how long that contact list will be is still a mystery.
We will keep the contact tracing going. It's good news so far, but the next 24 hours are still very important. We want to see more information, test results and wastewater results to give us even more confidence.
Instead of long lines for fireworks this Territory Day, there were long lines at the Marara testing site. Authorities want the public to also use the Palmerston and Royal Darwin Hospital clinics and only get tested if you need to.
Please consider whether you really are either symptomatic or actually in any way you've been exposed, and we're trying to identify constantly those people.
The Tanami mine outbreak reached 16 today with one new case in the NT. A man tested positive overnight while inside the Howard Springs quarantine facility. It's not believed he posed a threat to the public. But late today, the Territory Government held an urgent media conference. A new casual contact exposure site has been listed, the Stewart Park Corner Store. The man who visited the Buff Club visited the store at noon Sunday.
The person was under a legal direction to remain isolated and had already been scheduled for transfer to the Centre for National Resilience to continue his isolation. Before this happened, he broke the law. He broke the law and he lied about it.
Those who could have been exposed are told to remain at home, call the COVID hotline and health staff will come to you for a test. Earlier today, the Chief Minister was optimistic about lifting the lockdown tomorrow, but he says that decision will be made when the latest test results are returned in the morning. Isabel Musali, ABC News.
Reporter Felicity James is in Darwin and joins us now. Felicity, how concerned is the government about this new exposure site?
Well, Karina, as you heard just a short time ago, there was an urgent press conference held, which I guess gives some indication of how they're viewing it. They said they were bitterly disappointed, both the police, the authorities and the Chief Minister, with this man who has lied to authorities about his movements. And the reason they're concerned mainly is because they're not sure if he's been telling the truth about other places he may have been to. Not so much with this casual contact site, which he spent about 20 minutes at on Sunday. The issue with that particular site usually would be that it's frequented by vulnerable Indigenous populations. There's actually a homeless drop-in centre just over the road. Luckily it was on a Sunday and it was, like I said, just a 20-minute window where it's been deemed a casual contact site. They say there's one close contact they've already tracked down. They're spending the rest of tonight interrogating this man to find out whether there were any other things that he did not disclose. He is a close contact of the original case at the Tanami mine, the gold mine in Central Australia, and he also is the same man in his 50s that you may have heard about who spent time at the Darwin pub, the Buff Club, which became our first high-risk exposure site. Karina.
Felicity James reporting. The Queensland Premier says she's cautiously optimistic about the state's latest COVID-19 numbers after 2 local cases were detected. On the second day of the 3-day lockdown, she's warned Queensland isn't out of the woods yet as health authorities deal with 5 separate outbreaks.
Long testing queues as Queenslanders came out in droves. Out of almost 30,000 COVID tests, 2 cases of local transmission were recorded in the past day.
Very encouraging news today. We're not out of the woods yet. We've still got another 24 hours to go.
One case is a close contact linked to the Brisbane Portuguese restaurant cluster who had been in quarantine. The other is a 37-year-old woman who worked at the Qatar airline check-in counter at Brisbane International.
This lady in her 30s became symptomatic on the 27th of June, so that means her infectious period goes back to last Friday.
Some of the exposure sites listed include Officeworks at North Lakes, Coles at Marumba Downs and Anytime Fitness in Griffin.
Then she was with her colleagues from Menzies Aviation on the 26th and the 28th of June.
It's not yet known if she has the highly infectious Delta strain.
We'll just have to wait for another 24 hours to do another test on her to see if we can get more virus so that we can then sequence it.
Health authorities suspect the woman contracted the virus from an international flight crew.
Anyone who works at our international airport, Queensland Health will vaccinate, and it's really important they come forward.
No other close contacts linked to the 19-year-old casual receptionist at the Prince Charles Hospital have tested positive. Infectious disease physician Dr. Paul Griffin will lead the investigation into why she wasn't vaccinated.
Obviously, that work will start immediately, looking at the systems and the processes for the decision making.
The Health Minister has written to the 5 Queensland hospitals that treat COVID patients and has asked why the mandatory vaccination group shouldn't be expanded to include all hospital staff.
We want to have a much broader look and a much broader definition of who is our 1A workers who are potentially at risk.
Let me save you the ink. The answer is yes. Should have been done months ago. Get on with it.
Queenslanders will have to wait until tomorrow to find out if the lockdown will lift. Rachel Rieger, ABC News, Brisbane.
The former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has labelled the nation's vaccine rollout a comprehensive failure of public administration. His critique caps off a week of confusing messages and conflicting advice about the COVID-19 vaccines. That saw state and federal relations hit a new low. Political reporter Jane Norman explains.
Queensland's top health official,
please, can I just stop all this?
Doubling down.
I just put out the facts. Oh, yeah, thank you.
Facing question after question about this tirade.
Wouldn't it be terrible that our first 18-year-old in Queensland who dies related to this pandemic died because of the vaccine?
She's unfortunately out on a very lonely limb there.
Fellow medics distancing themselves from her remarks.
The role of a doctor is not to play God. It's up to patients to decide.
The Queensland intervention prompted by the Prime Minister's call to make AstraZeneca available to all adults and protect doctors against legal action in the event of a serious side effect.
The type of scaremongering we've seen coming from the Queensland Premier and the Queensland Chief Medical Officer don't help confidence. They do help anti-vaxxers.
The nation's expert advisory group ATAGI recommends Pfizer for those under 60, but it notes AstraZeneca can be used for under 60s. If Pfizer's not available, the benefits are likely to outweigh the risks and the person has made an informed decision. Still, ATAGI's co-chair remains cautious.
I do not believe at this stage that young people should be receiving AstraZeneca.
The chance of someone under 50 developing the blood clotting disorder is 3 in 100,000. The chance of dying, 1 in a million.
Since the Prime Minister made this announcement, 2,616 Australians under 40 have chosen, with informed consent, to have AstraZeneca.
Suggesting that 5 months into the vaccine rollout, younger Australians are tired of waiting for Pfizer doses scheduled to arrive later this year.
The claims that we're at the front of the queue on vaccines were not true.
I can't think of a bigger black and white failure of public administration than this.
Scott Morrison will emerge from 2 weeks in quarantine tomorrow and head straight into what could be a hostile National Cabinet meeting. It'll be his first chance to explain to state leaders the sudden change to the vaccine rollout that caused so much confusion this week. Jane Norman, ABC News, Canberra.
More than 161,000 Australians received a vaccine today. That's the most in a single day since the rollout began. But as ABC analyst Casey Briggs explains, new data has shown just how challenging the next few months will be.
4.5 months into the vaccine rollout, we're now only just now getting full vaccine data from the federal government by age group and split between dose 1 and dose 2. Just under 8% of people aged over 16 are fully vaccinated. About 30% of people in the same age group have at least one dose. But as you'd expect, the rates vary dramatically by age group. Less than 10% of people in their 20s have a first dose. About a third of people in their 50s have a first dose. And when you get to the people aged over 70, you get first dosage rates of around 70%. But most of these people are not fully protected, partly a function of the AstraZeneca gap of 12 weeks between doses. Nationally, the vaccination rate has been pretty flat for a while, 110,000, 115,000 doses a day, and that's not really improving at the moment. The federal government does say that if these vaccination rates continue through the end of the year, well then about 72% of us could expect to have had a first dose by December. It's a big question over whether that vaccination rate will actually continue, because most of the doses that we're expecting through October are still AstraZeneca. In fact, we're getting far more of AstraZeneca doses than we need on a weekly basis through October than we would need to vaccinate everyone aged over 60. With all the health advice this week, are there going to be that many younger people willing to take up the millions and millions of leftover doses?
Still to come on ABC News this evening, Australia's property boom reaches the country. Plus, Nick Kyrgios progresses to the second round at Wimbledon despite a concerning fall. Australia's longest war is over, with the country's last remaining troops leaving Afghanistan after a 20-year mission. The Defence Department is expected to publicly confirm the withdrawal in coming days when the final US forces also leave the war-torn country. Here's Defence correspondent Andrew Green.
Bagram Airfield outside Kabul once hosted 38,000 American troops. The few who remain are packing up fast.
The war has started before I was born, so it's like crazy that I get to be here to close it down.
With Taliban fighters steadily regaining ground, the US withdrawal could be complete within days.
The loss of terrain and the rapidity of that loss of terrain has to be concerning.
Over recent weeks, the former enemy has overrun dozens of districts once held by coalition forces.
We're starting to create conditions here that won't look good for Afghanistan in the future if there's a push for a military takeover.
Australia's lengthy deployment began just after the September 11 attacks on America. After almost 20 years and the loss of 41 diggers, military officials say a formal Australian withdrawal from Afghanistan, announced in April, is now complete.
For international forces, longest war ends, but the war for Afghan people will continue.
Unlike other nations who've pulled their last troops out of Afghanistan, Australia is yet to publicly confirm its formal withdrawal. The Defence Department says it won't comment for operational security reasons, but has flagged a statement will be made in coming days. As America completes its exit, former Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who oversaw the entry into Afghanistan and Iraq, has died.
There are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns.
Afghanistan's future now facing numerous unknown unknowns. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
The death toll from the Miami building collapse has risen to 18, with 145 people still unaccounted for. Some of the latest confirmed dead include 2 children aged 4 and 10 who were found just hours after the body of their mother was discovered. The search and rescue operation in the debris of the Champlain Towers has now completed its 7th day. Volunteers say the grim task is beginning to take its toll.
This has been emotionally the most difficult thing I ever had to endure.
The US Safety Agency has announced a technical investigation which could lead to regulatory change, but concedes that could take years to complete. China's leader Xi Jinping has hit out at countries that sanctimoniously lecture China at a major speech to celebrate 100 years of the Communist Party. In front of thousands of people in Tiananmen Square, he channeled Chairman Mao, declaring China will never be bullied by other countries and warning it isn't afraid of conflict. Here's China correspondent Bill Birtles.
It doesn't get more red than this. The hammer and sickle, communist luminaries, and a huge live gathering of the loyalist of the loyal. And presiding over them all, one man leading a nationalist revival.
The Chinese people are people who uphold justice and are not afraid of violence.
Xi Jinping has reinforced that the Communist Party has an iron grip on the world's most populous country and is leaving no room for anyone to question it. Brimming with confidence after bringing COVID under control, he spruiked the party's economic success and got the biggest cheer for this line.
The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, oppress or enslave us. Anyone who dares try to do that will have their heads bashed, bloodied against the Great Wall of Steel, forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people.
Under Xi, China's space for public debate has tightened, and stoking nationalism is the one safe bet for commentators, bloggers and public figures. Such displays shore up support at home, but experts say it's hurting China's interests abroad.
They are not used to being a country which speaks from a position of power and influence. They don't realise how disturbing people find that display of power.
There were no indications from Mr Xi's speech that things will get any easier for Australia dealing with this increasingly prickly superpower that appears united and confident, at least on the surface. Bill Birtles, ABC News.
We'll host a special program tonight, the Long March, 100 Years of the Chinese Communist Party, at 9 o'clock Eastern here on the ABC News channel and anytime on ABC iView. Property prices are not just booming in the city, it's also happening in the country. Farm prices in Tasmania have skyrocketed in the last year. Rural reporter Fiona Breen takes a look at the market.
This is one man's dream, 718 hectares of prime agricultural land on the banks of the River Derwent near Hobart.
I bought Tassal out of receivership, in about 2005, and then I bought a lot of water up north, but I never really had any property to go with it. So this is the first chance to snap up some rural sort of agricultural land.
The Melbourne-based investment advisor bought the farmland sight unseen.
Whether I do something with sheep, cattle, it could be viticulture.
The price of Tasmania's farmland has increased by just over 25%. It's been the greatest in the northwest, up 26.7%. In the north, prices haven't risen as much, but they've still jumped 21%. In the south, there's been little movement.
A number of attributes that are attracting buyers, but the largest would have to be the irrigation, in my opinion.
While new irrigation is boosting interest, a good season and high commodity prices are also part of the reason for the growth.
It'd be fair to say that the supply of properties that meet their criteria are few and far between at the moment, and being sold sometimes without actually hitting the market.
Large corporate investment funds are active in the Tasmanian market, but so too are local farmers, eyeing off that nearby or neighbouring block, hoping to expand. And in some cases, they're willing to pay a little bit more. That's the case in the Northern Midlands, where two large grazing properties are changing hands for the first time in decades.
I suppose we're seeing the next generation of farmers returning to the land, and I guess those families needing to expand their operations to facilitate that.
With supply well short of demand, rural land prices are expected to stay high. Fiona Breen, ABC News.
Time for a look at what's coming up on the business. Here's host Alicia Barry.
Tonight, left hanging. Casual workers again without income as half of Australia goes into lockdown. Plus, million-dollar listings. The top end of the housing market sees surging interest from overseas investors. All this and more at 8:45 Eastern.
Carlton will play Fremantle at the MCG on Saturday night after the AFL finalised another part of the round 16 fixture. The game will be a Fremantle home match and will begin after the Demons fixture against GWS at the same venue. Fans who attend the afternoon match will need to leave the MCG for cleaning ahead of the night game. Blues coach David Teague says he's unfazed by the change in location.
The fact we're not going over there is not a big factor for us, maybe for them. It's probably a bit harder for Freo not getting to play at home.
All 18 clubs are now based in Victoria because of the ongoing COVID-19 outbreak around the country. The North Queensland Cowboys have been allowed to resume training after coach Todd Payten returned a negative coronavirus test. He'd been at a Townsville exposure site at the weekend and was deemed a close contact. Despite the results, he will still have to isolate for 14 days. The squad also trained without Thomas Gilbert. He's been ruled out of Saturday's match after travelling to Magnetic Island.
We've had a pretty disruptive start to the week, obviously with the whole lockdown and protocols that's happened over the last 24 to 48 hours.
Meanwhile, the Broncos have confirmed signing Maroons utility Kurt Capewell next season. He's done a 3-year deal with the struggling Brisbane club as part of their so-called rebuild in 2022. The Broncos have also granted Matt Lodge an early release from his contract. He'll join the New Zealand Warriors with the trade effective immediately. Australia's Nick Kyrgios has prevailed in a delayed 5-set classic at Wimbledon to progress to the second round. The world number 60 beat the 21st seed Frenchman Hugo Humbert, while Jordan Thompson upset the 12th seed Casper Ruud. Here's national sport correspondent David Mark.
The match that had to be stopped because of Wimbledon's 11 p.m. curfew resumed at 2 sets and 3 games all.
Any more questions? No? Good luck.
After 6 months off the tour, Nick Kyrgios was feeling the effects of a long match.
Just limbering up. Yeah, you can see him just trying to stretch it out there.
The game stayed on serve with Kyrgios firing.
Excellent service game from Kyrgios.
But at 6 games, drama as Kyrgios fell on Wimbledon's notoriously slippery grass. But he gathered himself and his sense of humour.
Good shot.
At 7 games all, Kyrgios finally broke Humbert.
He's got it.
Then survived 2 break points to hold his serve and win 9-7 in the 5th set.
And it's a victory for Nick Kyrgios. Sensational.
Yeah, not too bad for a part-time player. It didn't take me much to get me off the couch in Canberra, Australia. Wimbledon's one of my favourite events, and I heard there was going to be some crowd. I love playing here, so it was an easy decision for me.
Jordan Thompson needed some assistance after going up by 2 sets to 12th seed Norwegian Casper Ruud and then losing the next 2. But he won 6-2 in the last to record his biggest win at a Grand Slam and his first at the All England club.
Oh, and he's through! Jordan Thompson wins a match at Wimbledon for the very first time.
The bad news for Thompson is next he's got to play Japan's Kei Nishikori, who beat Australia's Alexei Popyrin in straight sets.
And they'll do it.
Aya Tomljanovic had her problems, but held on to beat Belgian Griet Minnen in straight sets. David Mark, ABC News.
French police have arrested a woman who caused a massive pile-up during the opening stage of the Tour de France. The Spectator had been holding a sign and leaning into the path of veteran rider Tony Martin, who fell off his bike and took down dozens of others. Tour organisers have announced they'll take legal action against the fan. Last year's winner Tadej Pogačar took out the 5th stage time trial.
He won 3 stages last year. He took yellow into Paris. Pogačar will be taking the stage, and by 18 seconds to Kung.
Perfect conditions. Also, the temperature for me was perfect. So today was a really good day for me.
A Slovenian blitzed the field in the 27-kilometre course to move up to second place in the general classification. Australia's Richie Porte finished 9th and sits 25th overall, nearly 4 minutes off the pace. Here are the top stories on ABC News. Investigations are underway into the source of 7 of today's 24 new coronavirus cases in New South Wales. Authorities are concerned about transmission at workplaces. The Premier is urging essential workers not to go in if they're experiencing any symptoms. Authorities in the Northern Territory are considering whether to extend Greater Darwin's lockdown. Investigations have revealed a man who tested positive defied health directions and went to a corner shop when he should have been in isolation. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull has described Australia's vaccination program as a phenomenal failure. Nearly 8% of the adult population has now been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Mr Turnbull says the nation is far behind where it should be. And China has celebrated 100 years since the Communist Party was founded with a massive parade in Tiananmen Square. The President, Xi Jinping, has declared his country won't accept lectures from other nations, alluding to possible further diplomatic tensions. A major fight over the number of people allowed to fly in and out of Australia looms at National Cabinet tomorrow. The Labor premiers are all angling for a reduction in the weekly travel cap over fears the Delta variant poses too great a threat to hotel quarantine. Breaches of the hotel program have sparked the nation's lockdown crisis.
Brendan Dillon is fighting fit, ready to come home from Los Angeles. But it's proving increasingly difficult.
It's just going to be near impossible for us to kind of come home for an extended period of time, and that frustration with all us Aussies overseas is just building.
He recently got married, but only one person was there to witness the wedding. He wants to get home to celebrate, but that's looking unlikely if some premiers get their wish.
That it is better to lock some people out than to lock everyone down.
If Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews gets his way at National Cabinet tomorrow, the number of international arrivals will be slashed by up to 80% over the next 3 months. That's to give time for more vaccinations and to reduce the risk of more costly quarantine leaks.
No one wants to see this happen, but as everyone knows, our systems are stretched. So today I've written to reduce our caps by 50%.
Queensland is frustrated after a man who was positive spread the virus into hospital. He was able to travel to and from Indonesia multiple times. In Western Australia, hundreds have been through hotel quarantine multiple times.
This is a big problem, and until we're all vaccinated, we really need to crack down very, very, very heavily on the number of Australians who are permitted to go overseas.
There are 34,000 Aussies still overseas who have registered to come home. Most are trying to return from the USA, the UK, India, Thailand and the Philippines.
Australia has some of the tightest border controls in the world that have been managed as successfully as anywhere else in the world to keep Australians safe and secure, and we're going to continue to do that.
The states are keen to highlight that Australia is at risk because so few people are vaccinated. It's a point they'll continue to make, warning that until everybody gets a chance to receive a jab, lockdowns will remain a blunt weapon to fight this virus. Richard Willingham, ABC News.
North Queensland residents